Okay, hi, I'm Everett Evnen. I was born December 8th, 1927. I was born in Lincoln General Hospital, which has since been remodeled 3 times, here in Lincoln. And then I got old. What's next? What else?
I want to hear about your parents.
Oh, my parents were both born in Russia, and I don't have the exact information on where they were born, but they came here in the early 1900s after my grandfather, who had come here earlier, and he came. One of my grandparents came through Galveston. I think maybe the other one came through New York. And my grandfather on my mother's side was a farmer and a miller in Russia and had an orchard. My other grandfather was a little tiny guy that was like a cat, and he was a carpenter, a superb carpenter, could carve anything or build a house, whichever you wanted, which he did both. And after he escaped from Russia, he went to Scotland for a year, where he earned enough money to bring his family here. My dad and my grandmother had 4 children, five. One of them had passed away in Russia. And so they came. 2 of them were born here. The other 2 came with my mother and some relatives, my grandmother and some relatives, and the other grandfather came. He was a farmer. He farmed. He had several farms east of Lincoln, west of Lincoln, and he was like the French angel. He was just like looked like a piece of wood, a stalk of tree. He was really a tough little guy, but he was real short, and he loved mules. He had mules on his farm. I was there once. He also had a turkey, a terrible turkey that was kind of a watchdog, and if you bent over or anything like that, the turkey would jump on you and peck you in the head. So my grandfather made a whip for me and a chair that I could go jump on and hit the ground and scare the turkey off. They found it dead one day. The hired man cut its head off and threw it. That was the end of the turkey. But my father saved me once. Coming around the corner, they were sitting on the porch, and the turkey was chasing me, chopping at my head. I don't recall that. I know they tell me I climbed the windmill, and they had a terrible time getting me down. I was only like 4 years old. And when ultimately I bought a farm, I took my mother out to the farm. She said, "Where's the orchard?" And I said, "Well, I don't have an orchard. There's no house. There's nothing out here." And she said, "You can't have a farm without an orchard." So I have an orchard out there now with several trees, and they're a lot of trouble, but my mother loved orchards. Then my other grandfather, he continued to build houses. In fact, he bought a little house and added on 2 stories, so he'd have a place for his kids to sleep. That property is, that house is actually, part of my business is on that property right now, because I ultimately bought the houses and expanded and ended up with those houses. Then he had a little furniture store, a used furniture store, and I remember one day he came home with a big branch in his hand, big piece of, off a tree, and what had happened that he had purchased a table with only 3 legs, and he got a hold of a piece of walnut, and he's down in his basement, which was a dirt floor down there and old tools, and he just carved the 4th leg and put it on that table, and it made a pretty nice table. My father said he was a great man at building tables and chairs and houses, but he was the worst finished man he'd ever met. So whenever it came time to put varnish on and so forth, my dad would do that. They ultimately had to move into town because of my grandfather, Latween wife, got sick and passed away, and so he had to give up farming. But then he remarried and moved to Denver. And when she passed away, he moved back to Lincoln. And he was in Denver. He was doing window washing and a little bit of everything. Oh, they had a delicatessen. They had a little store, a Jewish store in Omaha, a little grocery store and bakery. But they wanted to sell it, and some people came in, and he ended up buying a gold brick. The story you hear about gold bricks are true. He had a gold brick, and the key to the locker it was in, and it gave them all of their money, their jewelry, their watches, and everything else. And then the guy didn't show up, and they went to the locker to get the gold brick out, and it was lead and painted. And, well, they went to Denver, and when she passed away, he came back, my mother's father, and I'll never forget, his name was Lettween, Lettween, and he had his fortune with him, and he wanted a banker, so I took him over to the bank, and I introduced him to the president of the bank. He wanted to meet the president of the bank, so he did. And it was a bank that I was dealing with, so I was familiar with them. And so the banker said, well, what's your name again? And he said, Sam Lettween. Lettween, and my first name is Sam, like in Hunkle. And he said, now would you remember me and say hello when I come in the bank? Well, hell, everybody did. When he came in the bank, little Sam Lettween, well, hi, Sam. Hello, Sam. I don't know how much money he had, but it wasn't an impressive amount, but it sure impressed him. Anyway, that was Sam Lettween. He was a real pistol. My other grandfather was an also interesting story. When he tried to leave, he was going to be drafted, and they were having pogroms in Russia at that time. And he was told that if he bound up his leg and made it swell, when he went to be to the army, they would give him a deferment. So he bound up his leg, and it did swell up terribly, and they did give him a deferment. But 6 months or a year later, they called him again and said he's probably well by now, so maybe he better come again. Well, he bound up his leg again, only this time he bound up so bad that he developed gangrene, and the doctor, when he was deferred, but the doctor wanted to amputate his leg. Well, he wouldn't let him do that, but they lived by a river in Russia, and in the middle of the night he took a probe or a knife of some kind and lanced his leg and went and sat in the river all night long. And he survived. He had a limp, but he survived. He was a real character. But I don't think he ever knew my name. He used to call me Sonny. And he'd say, hello, Sonny. I don't know if he ever knew my real name. I never did figure it out. I know that he was, in those days people were conservative. He would walk 2 or 3 miles to save a penny or two on his cigarettes. Anyway, they had my father and a brother. My father was also in the furniture business initially before the Depression and during. He put his other younger brother through law school. He became a very fine and well-known and great lawyer. I always thought he was very highly respected. And then he had 2 daughters. One of them married a gentleman and moved to Des Moines, and he was with the Postal Department. And they had a son who was a psychiatrist, living now, retired. He was a head of the department in Tulane of psychiatry, and retired and moved to Hawaii, because that's where he took some internship originally. So he's still living in Hawaii, in a lap of luxury. And the other daughter married and passed away. She had 2 sons, one of whom is a lawyer in Chicago, and they had several children. One of them went to Yale and got her PhD at Yale, went on the staff at Stanford, and wasn't happy teaching whatever she was teaching, and went back to school and became a lawyer. And she's now practicing in California, seeking to, I suppose, sue Stanford or somebody. Then I have a sister who went to the University of Nebraska, and she got her PhD in Connecticut. She's a speech and hearing person. That's what she got her, and her husband is a rabbi of quite renown. Had a big congregation in Hartford. I think they had like 1,300 members. They spent a great deal of time in Israel. She started the speech and hearing clinic at the Hadassah Hospital, and 2 years ago they built a building and named the building after Dr. Maureen Kessler for her hearing. She did a lot of work on hearing, and goes there regularly and works in that department and so forth. They're back. They come back here. They live in Hartford, but they love to go to Israel and spend several months a year there. Well, let's see, where are we? We're up to who? My parents.
What did your father do after the Depression?
Oh, my father lost his business, and he paid all of his debts and closed his store, and they bought a tiny grocery store on 1027 North 23rd in Lincoln, which was across the street from the Johnson Coal Company and about 50 yards from the railroad tracks. And the little tiny store was 6 feet away from a walkway which went to a little tiny house that we lived in. My mother ran the store, and my father started out working for some friends selling cars, Novikovs, I think. I'm not sure who, but anyway. But he made a mistake. He parked the car in the driveway, and the little boy next door and we played car. We broke out the headlights, the tail lights. We put sand out of the sandbox in the gas tank, and we ruined, well, anyway, they hauled the car away, and my father went out of the car business and went to work in the insurance business, where he spent Prudential. He spent his life with Prudential. Now, he never liked what he was doing. He never hated it, but he loved the furniture business. He just never had an opportunity to do what he really wanted to do. But he was a very, very bright man, and my mother ran the store for a while, and then we finally moved from there, and she went to work selling ladies' ready-to-wear in downtown Lincoln, where she became the manager and ran the Amos Dress Shop for all those many, many years, while my father sold Prudential Insurance. And that store was something else. It had, I can remember my father, they used to catch rats in those days because we were right next to a railroad track, and the bums would come and we'd feed them. But they were all fine, good. We never had any difficulty of any kind. In fact, they always offered to work, and they were really a little different than they are today, but maybe. They would trap rats, and every time they'd catch a rat, he had a pipe he'd hook up to his car and put the rat in this cage in a box and gas the rat. I only got to see him do that once. He didn't let me watch that too often, but anyway, they sold the store and moved to our house on 2344 D Street, where I grew up. Went to local schools of Prescott and Irving and Lincoln High, which was like the only school at the time. And my sister did the same. She met her husband, who was Stanley Kessler, who was a rabbi, became a rabbi, but she met him because he was a radio gunner, I think, on B-24 or B-26 during the Second World War, and finished his missions and came back and landed at the air base and stayed at the air base in Lincoln. He was looking for a Jewish girl, and he found my sister, and that was the end of that. And he was very happy, so was she. So that's really how she met him. He did his missions in the Army, but he never ever has talked about it. It's an interesting thing. Can't even. He just isn't interested in discussing it at all. My my life personally, I just went to the University of Nebraska, and then I was able to start university a semester early because during the war, if you had your hours completed, they'd let you go. So I started at 2.5 years and went to the University of Nebraska, where I spent a year, and then I was 18. And when I was 18, I enlisted. The war was over a few months before that, but I was going to be drafted, and I was able to enlist in a program for 18 months. And I thought, well, that isn't a bad idea. I better do that. So as soon as I was 18, I did enlist, and I spent a year or so overseas in Japan in the occupation force. Got to be first sergeant before I came home. But they sent us to another guy from Indiana. I went to finance school, and there's a book called The Official Mileage Table. And when I left finance school, I took that official mileage table with me. I didn't think two things about it, but I went directly to Japan, and I had the only official mileage table in the whole damn country. So they were calling me from all over, and my major said, I'm putting you in charge of these special vouchers. Now, those people had fought and were there temporarily, and this fellow that was in special vouchers in our finance office in Kobe had a pile of finance papers that he didn't know. He couldn't even read the headlines. He didn't know what they were. And the major said, when you get those all done, come and see me. Well, about a month or so later, and I was a private, and a month or so later, I had them all done, sent them all out, took care of all the vouchers, did the whole thing. I went and said, Major, we're current on our special vouchers. And he said, well, that's wonderful, Sergeant, and we'll go from there. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, you're now Buck Sergeant. So I was never a PFC, and I was never a corporal. I went from private to Buck Sergeant, later staff, and then I got to be first sergeant of the outfit. But and then but it was I was a staff sergeant, and to become a master or a first sergeant was a double jump, and he got a bad letter about just taking me from private to Buck Sergeant. So he said, if you'll stay with me and re-enlist, I'll make you a master sergeant. You really haven't. I said, well, I don't think so. I came home, went back to school, graduated from the university, and went to work. Actually, I got a job. Harley Davidson got me a job in Kansas City, selling boys' wear, boys and men's sports shirts. And Harley Davidson was the head of the department at Gold's Department Store. He was quite a guy. But we had a friend here in Lincoln, Arthur Gordon, who was a pilot, and he was selling ladies' slips and fancy stuff, and he called me one day after I'd been working for 3 or 4 months and said, go take your line, turn it in, you're going to go with me from now on. And I said, well, what am I going to do? And he said, well, he had the region for a special kind of slips, seam-proof slips or something, and he couldn't take another line on, but he had this fancy line, and he just was going to have me take that and go with him, which we did. And he was flying a Beechcraft Bonanza, so I started learning how to fly a Beechcraft Bonanza. And after a month or two, we crashed that Bonanza in St. Louis on the runway, and I was back to driving around selling. So we were just making the major cities all over. We'd go to Minneapolis and Chicago and St. Louis and so forth. But the gear collapsed on that airplane, and we just went sliding down the runway. It scared me half to death, but with no harm done, except we demolished the airplane. It really did a lot of damage. So then I started driving, and that's when I met Elaine. My folks had known the Shermans in Sioux City in the Everett Club, which was a club. I don't know if you're familiar with it or not, but the Everett Club was a social club that was, I think, Des Moines, Sioux City, Lincoln, and anybody else, I guess, who wanted to join. But anyway, my mother said, when you get to Sioux City, call the Shermans. They have a daughter, and you can meet her, and you'll have somebody to meet. So I went to this place and that place, and I was raising hell, and I got to Sioux City, and I called for Elaine, my wife. And her mother said, oh, she's not here. She's in Minneapolis right now. She'll be home in a week or two. So I didn't think too much of it. So I called again the next time, and I said, how about, can I talk to Elaine? And her mother said, oh, no, she's in Des Moines. She's with some friends and so forth. I thought, I better meet this gal. Well, the next time I went in there, I did meet her. And I thought, well, I better not take a chance on missing her again. So we got engaged about 6 months later and got married. And, well, we have 4 kids, and we've been married all these years. We've had a pretty interesting marriage.
When you got married, Everett, were you still traveling, selling?
She wouldn't have anything to do with, she said, I'm not marrying a traveling salesman. And her father was in the produce business. They were in the car lot processing of turkeys and fowl and eggs. And in the 50s, when this all happened, the poultry that you got was from farmers. They would go and take them to little stations in little towns all around, and then we'd gather by those, bring them back to Sioux City, and then run them through a processing plant and pack them up, and we'd sell truckloads or carloads to chain store groups and stuff like that. And we put up carloads of frozen eggs and shell eggs, where we had a bunch of girls candling eggs, and then we'd sell them to the people who resold them. He also raised turkeys. He had a farm at O'Neill, and he raised about, 60,000, 70,000 turkeys at O'Neill, and we had a farm at Sioux City. We raised another batch of turkeys, and a farm at Sergeant Bluffs, where they raised hogs. And the reason they raised hogs was because in the processing plant, the offal would go into a big tank truck that we would cook right in the truck, and then take it out and feed that offal to the hogs. So we, in the winter and the spring, when we were processing poultry, we would take the offal to the farm at Sergeant Bluffs, or else when we were doing eggs, we would take all the bad eggs, the spoiled eggs, put them in cream can, and take them out and dump them in troughs for the hogs. So we had hogs that were really raised well. They were eating eggs for breakfast, and I had chicken for lunch. And then we went to Johnson Biscuit Company and bought all their old cookies and so forth. And so they had chicken and eggs and biscuit and cookies for dessert. They were a pretty good-looking bunch of hogs. And all that egg really made their coats beautiful. And we had a couple of hundred hogs at the time. We also had 60 hogs that we were farrowing who got sick from a thing called leptospirosis, and we had to give them up. But in the meantime, I worked at the processing plant, and I know my father-in-law said, "Come to work for me," and I said, and my wife thought that's a good idea. And I had one brother-in-law who was already there. So I went to work there, and I remember when I first started, my father called me one day and said, "How you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm shoveling chicken poop. That's my job. I'm feeding all these old chickens, and I'm cleaning these cages." And he said, "Is that bad work?" I said, "Well, it's terrible. I mean, I'm a college graduate shoveling chicken poop." And he said, "How's the pay?" I said, "The pay's great." He said, "Well, if the pay is great, you can put up with a lot of nonsense." And but I did I did learn quite a bit there, and I really enjoyed the turkey part. And ultimately, I decided I didn't want to be in the processing business. and we didn't have I just didn't like the whole arrangement and so forth. I wasn't the best of friends with my father-in-law because I didn't like the way he was doing things. And after all, I'm 21 years old. I know everything there is to know. And so we moved back to Lincoln, and I went into the poultry distribution. At that time, there was a big change in the industry. The poultry industry began to change because instead of buying chickens from farmers, we were buying poultry then, or able to buy poultry, from people who are raising chickens in Arkansas and Missouri and down south, and they would raise them in houses, and we would buy broilers by the truckload all year long. Before that, spring chickens was what were the culls out of the flocks, and we would have fried chicken early in the year, but never the rest of the year because they weren't available. But now fried chicken is what you go in the grocery store, you find chicken all over the place. Fried, you just take it home and fry it, or you can buy it pre-cooked. But but that's when the whole thing started. And so when I came back to Lincoln, nobody was distributing poultry like that. They were still floundering about with the old chickens and one thing or another. And so I started the distribution business of ice-packed poultry. And our business has grown from there. Now we were doing about 95% poultry and some eggs. Now we're doing only about 7 or 8% poultry and 10,000 other items, because now we have departments that we will completely outfit a restaurant, from the kitchen, the tables and chairs and salt and pepper and every other thing. And we do that for some chain operations like Applebee's. We're doing one right now. And the restaurant, I finally changed from the selling grocery stores and so forth, their chickens in bulk. And I had a friend who ran a Village Inn here. And one day he said, "We're going to buy the Village Inn chain. You want in on this?" And I said, "Yeah, sure. You've got a good friend." So 12 of us bought the chain of Village Inn restaurants. And I was selling them some product, but then I said, maybe we ought to just sell you everything. And he said, "Go ahead." I was at the meeting in Denver, and they said, "Go ahead if you want to, whoever you're servicing." And so I had about 15 units, and so we did. And that's how I began to have a full service operation, because from there it became easy, because we had expanded the business, enlarged the business and so forth, and the space, and learned how to do salt and pepper and toothpicks and so forth. And that was really the start. And now, of course, we sell everything, including radishes and fruits and vegetables and several kinds of meat, all kinds of meat and dairy products. We sell milk too, because we're out in the country. We have like 35 semis that run around the country. We go to Texas, we go to Gillette, Wyoming, we go to Minneapolis, and all over Kansas City a couple times a week. And a lot of the stores in the country, the Valentinos or the Village Inns or some of the others, they want someone that'll bring them their lettuce and their tomatoes and other products of that nature, plus their dairy products. So we take them to them, buns or whatever else they want. And of course we've gone from just a few $1 million in sales up to, I think this year, probably $140 million. Well, then after I got into my own business, and I was doing fairly well, I decided I'd like to fly again. That was like in the early 60s. And I took lessons and flew, and I got a Beechcraft Bonanza. In fact, I had I've been involved in 5 Beechcraft Bonanzas and 1 Beech Baron, which is a twin-engine plane. And that's how I got involved with Bobby Duncan. I bought them all from Bob, but then he'd call and want me to, he'd say, I got to go to Miami. You want to fly? I need a co-pilot. You want to go down and show an airplane? I said, sure. So, and that was in Learjets. So then I went to, I flew down there with him. In fact, as I say, I called one of my daughters and said, you want to eat dinner? Because there was just the 2 of us going, and we were going to show the airplane the next day in Cleveland, I think. But she said, yeah. And I said, well, we're going to, pack your pajamas. We're going to go to Miami for dinner, which we did. She had a good time. Then once I went down for, let's see, I can't think of the guy's name, Tip Top Industries in Omaha. Carl Renstrom had a Learjet. And Bob said, we got to take this Learjet down to Acapulco, because Carl Renstrom had a Learjet, and he also had some hotels down there and a house. And I need a co-pilot. So I said, okay. So we flew down to Acapulco. I was down there for several days, and we stayed at the Carl Renstrom in his house. And that was kind of fun. And then, of course, I became active in the poultry industry and I was president of the National Poultry Distributors Association, Food Distributors Association, and then the airplane really came in handy because we were kind of organizing, and I was flying the darn thing all over with our secretary to meetings to generate membership. So I got around quite a bit with the airplane at that time. And then I also used it to go fishing in Canada several times, which I love to do, and Alaska. And then I flew out with my wife and another couple to Cat Island in the Bahamas. And we were all right, except those girls had so damn much luggage that the plane was porpoising, because as the gas gets low, then the CG, the center of gravity, gets goofy. Well, anyway, we got out there and I landed on Cat Island, which is the furthest island out, and just a little runway there. And you buzz the resort, and they drive out in a Land Rover and pick you up and go back to this little resort, a little thatched roof thing. And then we got ready to leave, and we couldn't get the tail of the airplane to stand up. It was a nose wheel and 2 wheels, and it's supposed to stand up, but the tail kept falling down because the center of gravity was so bad. And the guy that took us out said, he was an Englishman, he said, oh, I say, you're a bit heavy in the aft, old boy. And I said, yeah, why don't you lift the tail up till I get the motor going and everything else, and once I get it running, we'll get out of here. So he lifted the tail up, and everybody had to lean way forward. We had luggage in the front, and I got that thing off the ground, and then when we got, I think it was less than 100 or 200 miles, we landed and filled it with gas, and it was fine. But I had to land pretty often because we had so much luggage on that darn airplane. We were overloaded on CG. That was quite a trip. But the girls got eaten up with sand fleas, and they never forgave me for that. So we never went back to that Cat Island, which I thought was really nice. There was a guy from the U.S., from Ag Department or something, that was attacked by a shark out there. He was spearfishing, and he was carrying a fish he shot with his spear gun, and the shark came and attacked him and the fish. So we were kind of afraid to do too much swimming out there. But it was all right. We really had a good time. And then once I went to Alaska and flew all over Alaska with Bob, and there was they leased to the BLM their big 4-engine airplanes for the fire department that go over Alaska and stuff, put out the fires and stuff. And so his partner was up there, and he had a big 4-engine airplane, but He lost his hydraulics, and he couldn't. He had to land on a little strip, which was across the peninsula, way out in the bush. And when he started, it was a thunderstorm, and when he put on the brakes, he didn't have any hydraulics, and he's pumping the brake and trying to stop, and the ocean is coming. I mean, the lake is coming up. It was a very short runway. Well, he finally got it to take hold a little bit, and it spun off, turned off one wheel, and there it sat. Well, we went there to help him, so we were going to land on that same strip, and I'm looking at the strip and saying to Bob Duncan, Bob, you want to land this thing? That little thing, he said, just keep reading out the altitude for me and I'll take care of the rest. Well, we did land, and we managed to stop maybe, I guess 100 yards or so before we went off into the water. And we picked up his partner, Harry Barr, and took him back to Fairbanks, where we got a part and some oil to put back in the darn thing, and then took him back out there. He fixed the airplane and took that monster off from there. I don't know how he ever got it off. We didn't stay, but it was kind of an exciting trip. We've really had I've had some interesting trips. One time I took my Uncle Hi, my dad's brother, up to Canada, and he was a little leery altogether about flying, but he was fine. And I can't remember if that was in a Bonanza or the Baron, but we took off, but his door wasn't fully latched, and it popped open. Now, you can't fall out because the wind is holding the door closed, but it makes a horrendous noise. And I'm telling you, that man turned every color in the world before I was able. And you have to land. You got to go around and land and stop your speed in order to shut the door. So we landed, and I reached over and shut the door real good and took off again. He said, I don't want to do that anymore, you know. So that was kind of interesting.
Everett, and growing up, who were some of your contemporaries here in Lincoln, going through high school and so on?
Oh, my very two best friends were a young man named Sanford Finkelstein. Ben's New Way, he lives in California and still lives, and the other one is Bud Polsky, and he lives in Washington, D.C., and in fact, we get together pretty regular. We are lifelong friends and always have it. We had an arrangement, though, when we were in high school. I was the youngest one, and our deal was the first one to make $1 million was going to share it, and nobody has. I'm still waiting. But I'm still waiting for that deal. That was the one thing we never did get quite completed. But Bud is very successful, and so for Sanford too. And we are good friends and have been. By the way, I have a picture of my grandfather. You might want to see this. This is my grandfather, my mother's father. And I had a little tiny picture, and I blew it up on my computer. And that little fella is about 5. Well, look how much taller she is. He was just a little squirt, but he was quite a nice man. Were you able to get it? Well, I thought you might like to see that. And this is a picture of me, by the way, and my father when I was just a little fella. He's my dad was a really, really fine man. And you want another one? And this is a picture of Grandma Evnen. She ran the world. My sister and I are at the top of the picture, and my Arnold and Richard Soslak, my cousins, my father's sister's kids, are at the bottom of the picture. Arnold Soslak was editor of the paper at Minnesota, and he went to work for UPI and became quite a. They finally took him from. he became head of the department in Wisconsin, and then they took him to Washington, D.C. So Arnold Soslak, my cousin, and he was one of my very good friends. We were both in Japan at the same time after the war. He hated his job, and I loved mine, but I had my own Jeep. But anyway, he became a reporter for United Press International and had 2 or 3 of the permanent committees in Washington. He wrote 2 books, and he passed away kind of sadly. Had a back operation that was unsuccessful, and we lost him. But he was a very, very bright, very good friend. And so all the family done something. I mean, they're all over. They're all doing things. You know, you got to really got to hang with it. Like my wife's brother is a kind of he's living in Minneapolis now, but he has a very, very religious son who is a religious. I don't know what you call him. You know, he's got the hat and I would remember, except I'm getting old and I can't remember such things. But and then my wife's brother, Jim Sherman, is a lay rabbi and was for Sioux City for quite some time, and has recently moved to Minneapolis and still is working as a rabbi assistant and so forth. And he works at a little grocery store, Jewish grocery store, for one of his children's endeavors. And so everybody in our family is going some direction. I mean, it just seems kind of that way.
Everett, you were talking about how when you came to Lincoln, you started up the business. How were things at the beginning?
Well, I had $1,500, and I rented a building from a guy named Earl Hutchinson, who he had a locker plant, and he was getting old, and he said, and I'd known him he was a friend of my uncle's, and I'd known him for all these years, and I rented that building from him, and I was distributing chickens. I had myself and the guy that cut meat in the locker plant, and one other guy was delivering. Then the 3 of us started, and there was kind of no end to it. It just kept growing. Actually, I might mention that Harvey Lipsman at Northside Produce in Omaha and Oscar Diamond was extremely helpful to me when I first started. They were already successful in their business, and provided me with poultry, because I couldn't use whole truckloads, and they were drop dead off and so forth. And they were very, very helpful. And in fact, at one time, they proposed buying my business and making it we would go in partners. And there's going to be 3 partners, me and Harvey and Oscar. And I was kind of outvoted there. So anyway, I decided not to do that. And they went on their path in business, and I kind of changed mine a little bit. But Harvey was a very, very good friend and very helpful, and he's still around in Omaha. And in fact, I was talking to the Diamond, Oscar's boy, Richard Diamond, the other day at a bar mitzvah here, and he sees him regularly, and I remember that we need to get together and have a dinner or something, spend time, because we used to go to the Bohemian Cafe in Omaha. I still love it. Great duck, and if you want good duck, that's a place to go. Yeah, but he continued to go into the grocery store route, and of course we went the institutional route, which has survived a little better because the industry continued to change, and the way they are packaging product today, the grocery warehouse operations can handle poultry products without the mess and the smell and the ice melting and so forth. And so they do, and they just eliminated that middleman. They buy direct from the processors, prepackaged poultry, and they're really, well, we sell a little bit to some groceries, but very little. And yet the amount of poultry that's being consumed is enormous, for a couple of reasons. One, it only takes 13 weeks to produce a chicken. It takes 2 years to produce a steer. That 13 weeks allow people in the industry to change, to increase or decrease, and the being able to adjust the inventories and so forth is critical to the success of the industry. And in the beef industry, a little drought and a little bit of this and so forth seems to change it so drastically that those changes aren't happening in the poultry industry. Plus, because it only takes 13 weeks and the feed consumption is so efficient as compared to an animal, that the cost of poultry is much, much more desirable than the cost of beef. You spend a lot of money. But when I started, hamburger and chicken were about the same price, 29 cents. I mean, that would be you could buy a pound of hamburger or you could buy a pound of chicken for 29 cents. Chicken isn't that far off. Some kinds of chicken is maybe 75 or 80, but that hamburger is $2.20 a pound and so forth, or higher. So we, after all, if you're looking for economy and you're feeding families in one thing or another, then you're going to eat a lot of chicken. And it's healthy, boneless, skinless chicken breast doesn't have any fat in it, and it doesn't have any flavor. But that's okay. I mean, it tastes like cardboard to me, but I like fried chicken. You don't get that too often. Anyway.
I want to hear about your children.
Well, then we had 4 children. We had Robert Barnett Evnen. Robert Barnett was the oldest boy. He's now a lawyer. Interesting, he was born in Sioux City, and they named him Robert, which was okay. Barnett, and I said, what's with Barnett? Now you got to remember, I'm in Sioux City, and the Sherman family have me surrounded. I mean, there's relatives everywhere. So they decided, my in-laws and so forth, that it would be Barnett. Well, then I said, well, what's Barnett? Well, Barnett is he was an English man who was a member of Parliament or something. He was a real hotshot guy in London, in England, and we're naming him after this guy. By the way, when Richard got into college, he spent 1 semester in London, in England. So he looked up this fella to see who he's all about. Well, after he got out of prison, he was okay. I said, God, they named him after the wrong guy. It was a solicitor. But then we had Richard, who was the lowest, the number 2nd in the family. And he runs Lincoln Poultry at this point. He has been running it. He's been working there for about 25 years. And then we had a daughter, Jane, who is now associated with Bryan Hospital, and she's the director of education and so forth. And then we had another daughter 7 years later. That's another story because of Floyd Cookland. I don't know if everybody knows Floyd Cookland. Floyd Cookland had this distribution business. He was selling drugs and one thing or another. And we had a travel group. We met, and there was, I think, 12 of us. Well, Floyd came to the travel group. This was 7 years after our 3rd child, and said, I have a new product that women use to keep from having children. It was I don't know what you can't think of the name, but and I brought you samples. So he brought us all samples of this material, and you put it in, it's a foam, and it's got a little applicator, and along came our 7th child. So I am furious at Cookland, and I give him this thing back. I said, this stuff is okay for plugging watermelons, and you can maybe grease joints on your doors, but it doesn't keep you from getting pregnant. And he said, don't get too mad at me. I've given samples of this to everybody in my family, and they're all pregnant. I'm telling you, I got people in my family that want to kill me. So don't bother me too much, Ev, because you're not the only person I made pregnant. Everybody I know is pregnant with this dumb stuff. Anyway, so we had Judy, and we were a little bit dismayed, but it turned out to be a delightful young lady, and she's living in Kansas City with two beautiful children. Robert went to Michigan State, and then he went to USC Law School, became a lawyer at USC. Got past the bar in California, became a lawyer in Los Angeles, and ultimately became a member of a firm after, I think, 5 or 6 years. But in the meantime, he met a lovely lady and married her. She was from Hawaii. She's Hawaiian. Her grandfather, Bob's wife's grandfather, was a Jewish immigrant from Russia. And he went to the United States and ultimately went to Hawaii. There he married a Chinese lady who learned to keep kosher, and they had a son. And that son married a Portuguese lady, and that's where I got my daughter-in-law out of that union. But the father passed away at a very young age, and he remarried a real Hawaiian. I mean, a Hawaiian whose sister was consort to the queen. This guy's a real neat guy. So that's an interesting group, and she goes there every summer to spend a month or two. Takes her kids. They live in Honolulu, but they have a house on the ocean on the other end near Turtle Bay, on the other end of the island. Then Richard, of course, went to school up in Wisconsin, Beloit, and when he graduated, he came back to work at Lincoln Poultry, and has been there ever since, and has done a magnificent job. He's very, very bright, very capable, and he was married, and that was a disappointing marriage, and has 3 children, but he recently was remarried to a gal who was a dean of women's affairs at Doane College, and they're very happy. And then Jane, who is working, was a nurse, became a nurse, and and now she's working at the hospital. In not nursing, but she's in charge of women's affairs and education. She's very, very, very bright and does a really great job. Her husband is in the real estate business and sells real estate. And Judith, the daughter in Overland Park, Kansas, husband is a tech guy who he's been all over the world. He sells. He worked for Cisco, the electronics firm. Then he went to a firm they started, and now he's working at. That didn't work too well, so he's working at another firm where they sell equipment to like AT&T and this, that, and the other thing. And he's their chief engineer. So they got him running all over the country, all over the world, in fact. He goes to Japan and Germany and so forth. A very, very, very nice man, a guy I really am proud of. And they have 2 children, and their children reflect the intelligence of the parents. So they're going to be pretty bright kids, too. And we have a bunch of kids, and Bob has 3 children. One of them's going to Swarthmore right now, which is a fine college in Philadelphia. 2 of them will be one of these days. One of them will either be president or in prison. We're not sure which, but he's quite a boy. If you can see him, his hair is such that you can't make him out. And then Richard has 3 children, and they're all doing very well in school. One of them is a drummer, and he is a drummer's drummer, with the hair growing down around his face. But he was playing at a bar mitzvah the other night. He just took over the drums after the band left, and he fascinated everybody. He was just banging those drums all over. The other one, the 2, and then there are 2 girls in that family, and they're both really bright, and one of them's an actress, loves to be in the actress, and the other one plays the French horn. I don't know, our kids are doing things all over the place. So we really, and I have had, been very, very fortunate and had relative success. I was president of the NIFTA, and I was president of the executive club, and I was president of the synagogue a little bit, and now I've got the foundation, and I was Cliff Hilligus from Cliff Notes. I don't know if you ever heard of Cliff Notes. Cliff's a really good friend of mine. In fact, he's kind of helped me collect some of these 4-H books. He one day was over, and we had dinner, and I was showing him, and he said, "You mind if I got quite a few contacts, and you mind if I kind of ask around and see if I can get some of these for you?" I said, "No, go ahead." Well, that was a mistake because he didn't care how much he had to pay for them, and I ended up with probably another 75 books because of Cliff. And when he started a foundation, I became treasurer of his foundation. And so, I've had a lot of very good experiences in the hospital. I was active on several of the committees and so forth there. But I just recently stepped down because it was supposed to be a 3-year hitch, and I was on for 12, and I finally said, that's enough, and they thought it was enough. So that's what that phone call was from a little while ago, that we were going to go to dinner with the CEO there, and but he said, we got Richard on, my son is on a committee, and I'd like to make him chairman. So he's going to be chairman of the Health Enterprises, and I'm stepping down, but I still will, he said, but I want you to stay on the committee for a little while. And I said, well, okay. So, but I won't have the responsibilities that I've had in the past. Anyway, I keep telling people, go to Bryan Memorial Hospital. We've got you surrounded there, man. I mean, we could almost call it a Jewish hospital. Then Robert, the lawyer, he represents the anesthesiologist. He represents the Bryan Heart Institute, and he's got a medical, legal. He does law for the doctors now, and so I said between the four of us, we really Janie's on the thing. So, but anyway, we had a good time, and we have a hospital. Bryan Hospital, by the way, is a superb hospital, and we are doing things. We bought the city's hospital, Lincoln General, and we call it Bryan LGH, but their budget was $5 million a year. We've spent probably $150 million over there, and it is going to be a tremendous hospital now. It's just really lovely. So